Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What's the background for the rise of the egoic self? The question left before us is how the egoic self either feeds and grows or starves and withers. Considering that fruitfully cannot be done until we understand what the egoic self is and how it comes to be. Our egoic selves come from our surrealities. We've previously considered our surrealities. Compare video 23. Recall that every pure form, object, individual thing, is what it is and not another form. In the beginning, each of our consciousnesses confronts the primordial chaos, which is the domain of pure forms. What if there were no repetition or recurrence? What if every form ever encountered by consciousness were pure and different from every other form ever encountered? There would never be any understanding, and so no surreality at all. With no surreality, there would never be any egoic self. Since that's not the case, let's turn it around. There is repetition, or at least there appears to be repetition. Think of, say, Mother's face looming repeatedly over the crib. We are able to recognize such repetition. For example, this visual object is the same as that one that appeared before. The logical form is always this is that. If consciousness lacked the ability to make primitive identity two-in-one judgments, then that repetition would never be apprehended. As primitive identity judgments are used to simplify, reduce, cut down the number of pure objects into those taken to be entities, real, existent. Understanding, thinking, conceptualizing begins. Once made, identities can always be enforced. See Butch Ross, Being Qua Being. Once understanding begins, once there is an initial concept, principle of classification, it can not only be enforced, but also conceptual space can be expanded by making additional identity judgments and by noting relevant similarities and differences. That seems to me to be the best general explanation for the origin of conceptual hierarchies and how they can be indefinitely expanded and reconfigured. The experience of the primordial chaos has become the experience of a surreality, the appearance of a world. What though about a particular individual? How might that work? Specifically, in the primordial chaos, why does a particular individual single out certain pure objects for understanding and not others? Excellent question. I don't know. Any adequate answer, though, ought to involve 4 factors. One factor is surely the state of that individual's neurological system, the brain and body. If, for example, an individual is born blind, colors and visual shapes will be missing as possible forms to be singled out. Similarly, a deaf individual will be missing sounds. Some senses will be more acute than others. Obviously, then, one's inherited genes are relevant to the kinds of forms one is able to perceive and how well one is able to perceive them. A second obvious factor is simply the physical environment surrounding an individual. A warm environment, for example, would lack cold forms to be singled out. As different environments are experienced, the kinds of forms an individual is able to perceive increases. A third factor is simply the total ignorance of inexperience. A newborn hasn't yet learned anything. So a newborn has no understanding of what may be important or may not be important. In that sense, all forms are equal. Until they become unequal in value, biological survival is impossible without a caretaker. How is it possible to go from no understanding to some initial understanding? I may be ignorant of the relevant literature, but this seems to me to be almost never discussed. By way of contrast, our understanding now is extremely sophisticated. We almost never just single out objects. Instead, we perceive them as already conceptualized. Perceiving and conceptualizing are intertwined. I previously invited you in this playlist to think about walking into your living room and noticing your sofa. Since you've done that many times and you've learned the value of a sofa, you just perceive it as a useful sofa. As opposed to singling it out visually, categorizing it in terms of its similarities and differences to other forms, and concluding that it's a useful sofa. We have so much experience identifying forms that it's impossible to recapture the primordial chaos initially confronted by the consciousness of a newborn. A fourth factor seems to be an individual's karmic inheritance. This may seem a stretch, but it's unclear to me how else to explain the fact that energy testing reveals that newborn infants already have a calibration. Quote, each person who is born starts with a calibrated level of consciousness, which is shorthand for one's entire karmic inheritance, end quote. From I, by David R. Hawkins, MD, PhD. By entire, he's including one's collective karmic inheritance as well. The reason that this is important is because, quote, the subjective experience of life is profoundly influenced by the level of consciousness, as are the choices that appear as options, end quote. John Locke famously speculated that as newborns we were blank slates that experience would write upon and fill. All empiricists are inclined to think that way. Again, the ability to make identity judgments is innate. Although using it requires exposure to forms, it's not a learned ability. It's the ability that makes all learning possible. Although we're all similar in that respect, our slates seem to have been different depending upon our calibrated level of consciousness. It's worth mentioning, too, that all forms that are singled out stand out from a background, even as pure forms. In other words, forms considered in isolation from other forms. It's not just that a form singled out by itself is separated from all other forms, but also that the background of all forms is often ignored. To drive home the importance of this point, let me encourage you to imagine your favorite room. If you happen to be in it right now, you won't even have to imagine it because you can just look around and perceive it. Imagine that we're talking on the telephone. I ask you to describe to me that favorite room of yours, and you agree. What would you say? If possible, please pause this video for a moment and do it. Just quickly jot down a few words to describe your favorite room. Please do it. All right. Did you describe its size? Did you describe its ceiling, its floor, its walls, their colors, and what, if anything, is on them? Did you describe any furniture in the room and how that furniture is arranged? Are you confident that you've provided me with a thorough enough description so that I can easily imagine your favorite room? Here's the interesting question. Did you describe or just take for granted the essence of that room? It's unlikely that you mentioned it at all. The essence of something is its whatness, what it is. What is that room? You describe the room's qualities. What about its essence? What has those qualities? What is its essence? Space. A room is a chunk of space, isn't it? Did you mention that? When we look up on a starry night, we may single out, say, one particular star and ignore all the other stars. What, though, about the blackness that is the background for all the stars and other celestial forms? It's important not to neglect that, too. That's the context of the stars that are the forms in the visual field. We usually just take it for granted and so ignore it. The takeaway here is to be careful not to ignore backgrounds that are the contexts behind the forms that we single out for our attention. If so, how does the egoic self rise out of the background? Let's consider that, and then how it expands by feeding it, and how it contracts by starving it. Understanding that is important if we are to be clear about the for me that we've seen to be the core of every emotion. Let's end emotional distress